The one on a clapboard, like a... Hello, and welcome to the Ohio Northern SURF Undergraduate Research Fellowship Environmental Humanities Lab video podcast. We are a group of undergraduate researchers from different disciplines that have each done an independent research project about the environment using humanities methods. My name is Gabriel Mott. I am a double major in applied statistics and political science, and my project has been an interdisciplinary analysis of environmental rhetoric in State of the Union addresses. It's going to be really exciting. So, my project uses three major approaches. It uses some social scientifics text classification, political theory, and linguistic theory, and we're going to break them down in a moment. I opened with deciding my sample by taking every spoken presidential address to a joint session of Congress since 1970, which is both the first of Richard Nixon's administration and the year the Environmental Protection Agency was founded. So I read all of these transcripts and I classified them across 13 dimensions. They covered empirical matters, normative matters, and tone. So I considered whether or not the president mentioned environment, whether or not they mentioned climate change, whether or not they accepted human responsibility for climate change, as well as their support or opposition to things like subsidy, as well as their support or opposition to things like regulation, and then call to actions to the legislature and call to actions to the populace. And then for tone, I just considered optimism, pessimism, urgency, and dismissiveness. And I define these in relatively strict terms in my paper. And I found some interesting trends, so I'm going to put some graphs of my results on screen so you can see them, but we have a couple of noticeable trends. We have a sharp increase in the number of empirical mentions over time, and we also have a lot of variability between both the normative metrics and tone, and I'll sort of explain these with political theory later. And then I did account for the word count, the length of the speech, and didn't find a massive change in the results compared to when I was graphing row counts versus weighted decimals, so that's good news. And I also considered a presidential party as a way to separate the data. And the two things I found when I did that, and I'll also put those graphs on screen, is that the increase in empirical mentions over time is more concentrated among the Democrats, it's more pronounced. And then tonal matters are still varied, but they occur a lot more for Democrats than they do for Republicans. So, the second portion of my paper looked at some political theory to help explain some of those trends. I used the concept of the Overton window, which is the societally acceptable range of political thought, and it is relative and it can shift over time. And I say that this can help explain the increase in the total number of mentions over time. Some polling data that I took that's both broken down over time since the 1990s as well as broken by generation approximates a shifting of the Overton window to be more favorable to both the fact of climate change and climate change rectification policy measures. So that can explain why the president would feel more comfortable speaking about the climate and about environment and about policies like that explicitly without the fear of alienating voters or congressional allies. And then the second part, the normative statistics, those were super variable and hard to figure out. So I looked at game theory primarily to help explain it. And game theory is a sociological concept that's used to explain the decisions and movements of large groups of people, and I considered collective action problems and zero-sum problems. Collective action problems are characterized by conditions where every stakeholder benefits the same from a collective good, no matter how much they've contributed to that collective good, which is definitely true of climate change because we all feel the environment, and if it gets cleaned up, we'll be healthier and more prosperous whether or not we have contributed to the environmental cleanup. That's true on an individual and on a national level. We also looked at zero-sum problems where one person's win comes necessarily at another person's detriment. And oftentimes climate change is framed in terms of economic stakeholders and environmental stakeholders, but I found that that's not necessarily the case, which is really interesting. So my third part of my paper concerned linguistic theory as sort of a reference for the type of rhetoric I was finding in the political context. I sampled academic work on Aristotle's treatise, specifically on composition and ethos, pathos, and logos, and found some interesting disconnects, both in terms of the good of providing an explicit thesis. I found a couple of instances where presidents can actually express opposition to climate change regulation without mentioning climate change or the environment itself, which is really interesting and different than you would normally find out of Aristotelian rhetoric. And then I also found several instances of ethos and pathos being used relatively heavily. And that transitions well into the last thing I looked at in terms of linguistic theory, which is logical fallacy. I again sampled some scholarly work on sort of classical Greco-Roman ideas about it, and it's interesting because appeal to authority and appeal to pity are recognized as logical fallacy, but only when they are used in place of or in contradiction of a valid, reasonable argument. And it's difficult to decide in many of the climate change instances I point out in my paper whether or not something constitutes an invalid use of authority or of emotion, but I go through some examples in my paper and come to a relatively nuanced conclusion that it is mostly in line with linguistic theory, but maybe isn't. So that was my project. It was really exciting, and I look forward to talking about it. Thank you.
So, Gabe, that was really interesting what you just said. I'm just wondering, how would you define environment and why?
So I took a slightly more loose definition of environment than I think some of you guys did for your projects. I just considered any time that the interactive components of the ecosystem are considered in tandem, and then climate change normally being, in a sort of strict sense, the change of weather patterns over time, I allowed to be change in environment over time, because I had defined my project more fundamentally in terms of environment than of climate change.
So going off of that, what do you think, like based on your project, what do you feel like, what aspects of people's perceptions affect their actions toward the environment?
So I focused, of course, on the more political side, and I do think that your interaction with political figures and with other people talking about politics certainly impacts your political beliefs, and insofar as the environment has become sort of a politicized issue, it is also impacting your environmental beliefs, especially because any rectification measure that we might take is now would require political support.
So through this project, would you say you found very many ways research could be furthered? Any sort of new interesting takeaways or ideas you could maybe push past in this project?
Yeah, so one of the ideas that I had sort of coming out of it, which isn't a humanities method necessarily, but could be interesting, would be to take some larger scale text classification software and run a similar analysis on a very, very large data set, maybe something like everything that's ever been said on Twitter, for example, or all of the news articles that you can find off of CNN, and have just the scope. And the trade-off is, of course, that it isn't quite as tailored to the very specific things that I'm measuring and fine-tuning the political theory towards, but it could give you a much greater sense of scope and reference, and that could be really interesting for someone else to pick up where I left off.
See, so would that be a sort of like a database or more of like a spreadsheet? What would that look like exactly?
There are softwares that you can log into and use that can search the internet for that kind of stuff and process it all under the hood more or less, and then I can see the outputs. And yeah, I haven't played around with it a lot, but it's really interesting to me. I might use it later on in my career for something else.
So kind of going off of that, like you talked about in your future using it, is there like any other takeaways that you're gonna take from this experience and use in your future? And like, how did this make you think differently?
It was really interesting, and I generally try to be a politically conscious person. I think understanding the reasons why, generally speaking, the president might be saying what they are, or any political figure for that matter, is super important for the sake of media literacy, and it can help any person really come to their own conclusions as they think more critically and self-reflectively about the policies that matter to them most. So my takeaway, and the takeaway that I hope other people have after listening to this podcast or reading my paper, would just be a better understanding of the political systems and how they interact with the environment and how that can impact the way that you read and see and understand the rhetoric that you have all around you, because politics is all around us now. It's on Twitter and it's on the TV and it's everywhere. Well, thank you for listening. That was really great. Please tune in next week for Maddie's presentation on activism and the environment. And go Bears!